Big Shaq was once the king of the basketball court, the face of commercials, the symbol of athletic prowess and fame. His name carried weight, and his presence in a room made people stop and take notice. But the years had not been kind to him. The fame he once relished now felt like a distant memory, a faded echo of who he used to be. His athletic career had ended abruptly, and since then, he had been trying to navigate life in the aftermath of a public downfall. The tabloids had a field day with his personal struggles. His finances were shaky, his image tarnished, and the public seemed to care more about his failures than his past achievements. It felt like the world had moved on, and he had been left behind. The pride that once fueled his every move now felt like a burden, something he could no longer hide behind. He needed a way back. And for someone like Shaq, a flashy return to the spotlight seemed like the only solution. The plan was simple: buy a luxury car that would serve as a symbol of his success, a public declaration that Big Shaq was still relevant. A car dealership, high-end and exclusive, was the perfect place to make that statement. The brand new model, sleek and expensive, would be a symbol of his revival. Walking into the dealership, Shaq could feel eyes on him. Not in the way they used to be, filled with admiration, but more like a curiosity, an expectation. The world wasn't sure if he still had it, if he could reclaim what he once had. And Shaq, though proud, wasn't above the need for validation. He had learned to rely on the external markers of success, wealth, status, luxury, as his measure of worth. As he approached the counter, the manager, Charles, looked up from his paperwork. His eyes narrowed as he sized up Shaq. There was no sign of recognition or warmth, just cold, calculated judgment. Charles had worked in the high-end dealership business for years. He had seen countless celebrities walk through the door, each one thinking they could buy respect. He had no time for them. No time for the fake smiles, the handshakes, and the flashy cars that came and went with each new celebrity trend. He knew that these people didn't value the cars or the craftsmanship. They just wanted to appear important. Charles was bitter, worn down by years of dealing with people who used their fame to manipulate situations to their advantage. He had witnessed too many celebrities trying to buy their way into respect, but it was always shallow. It never lasted. To him, Shaq was no different. The former athlete walked in, trying to relive his glory days with a new car to match the image he was desperately clinging to. Shaq wasn't a man anymore. He was just a former name, a relic of a past that no longer mattered. The conversation started like any other. Shaq asked about the car casually, as if it was just another purchase he was making to satisfy an itch. He wasn't worried about the price. Money was no longer the problem, it was the public perception. The price tag on the car didn't matter if it didn't make the right statement. But Charles wasn't interested in playing along. "You think you can just waltz in here and pick whatever you want because of who you used to be?" Charles asked, his voice cold and condescending. Shaq was taken aback. This wasn't what he had expected. He had walked in expecting the usual show of deference, the kind he used to get. The kind of treatment that came with his fame. But Charles wasn't impressed. The manager wasn't a fan of celebrities using their wealth to buy respect. To him, it was all just a game, a facade, and Shaq was no different. "I'm not here to play games," Shaq said, his voice steady but laced with irritation. "I'm here to buy a car." "You don't get it, do you?" Charles shot back. "You're just another rich guy trying to buy respect. You're not here because you care about the car, you're here because you want to feel important again. And that's what I can't stand. I'm not going to be a part of that." Shaq's face hardened. He could feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface. He was used to people looking up to him, to people being awestruck by his presence. But here, in this dealership, the rules were different. Charles wasn't impressed, and Shaq's usual charm wasn't working. The pride that had always been his armor now felt like a weakness. This was the first time in a long time that Shaq felt small, invisible, and irrelevant. The conversation escalated quickly. Charles, not one to back down, accused Shaq of trying to use his celebrity status to get special treatment. Shaq, frustrated and trying to maintain control, refused to back down. He wasn't going to let this man talk to him like this. He was Big Shaq, damn it. You don't know who I am, Shaq said, his voice rising. I don't need your approval. I'm here because I want to buy this car. That's it. But Charles wasn't having it. The manager had been pushed too far. His own resentment for the superficial nature of fame and celebrity status had clouded his judgment. In a moment of pure frustration, he let go of his composure. With one swift motion, Charles punched Shaq in the face. The blow wasn't hard enough to cause serious harm, but it was enough to send a shockwave through Shaq's body. His pride, which had been the only thing holding him together, shattered in an instant. Before Shaq could react, Charles shoved him out of the dealership, his words echoing in the air. This is what happens when people like you think they can buy respect. Get out. No service for you. Shaq stood in the parking lot, dazed and humiliated. His face burned with the sting of the punch, but it was the blow to his pride that cut the deepest. The once mighty Big Shaq had been reduced to nothing more than a joke. He stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. He had been knocked down, but he wasn't about to let this define him. As Shaq got into his car, a mix of emotions flooded through him. Anger, frustration, and most of all, a deep sense of humiliation. But something inside of him clicked. He wasn't just going to walk away from this. He wasn't going to let this moment pass without taking action. This wasn't the end for him. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where he would prove that he could rise above the shame and rebuild his life. He wasn't done yet. And as he drove off into the distance, Shaq's mind began to race. He had a plan, a new kind of plan that didn't rely on fame or material possessions. A plan that would show the world what Big Shaq was really made of. Shaq drove aimlessly through the city, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. The sting of Charles's punch still lingered, not physically but emotionally. His pride, once so firm and unwavering, had been shattered in a matter of seconds. The high-end dealership, the luxury car, the expensive symbols of status he had hoped would bring him back to prominence, all seemed so meaningless now. He had become a figure of ridicule, and it stung deeper than any loss on the court ever could. But as he drove, something inside him began to shift. Anger boiled inside, but not the usual rage he'd direct at an opponent. This was different. This wasn't about defending his name against slander or fighting off critics who had always been quick to tear him down. This was about something deeper, something about how he had come to define himself by what others thought of him, by the very image he had built over the years. He had been that larger-than-life figure, the one who everyone looked up to, admired, and envied. But now, he wasn't sure of who he was anymore. The fame was gone, the admiration fleeting. He had been reduced to just another person looking for a way to hold on to something that didn't belong to him anymore. He wasn't a champion anymore. He was just Shaq, a man struggling with the weight of expectations that no longer fit him. The reality of his situation sunk in deeper with every passing minute. The material world, the fame, the wealth, they were all distractions, illusions that kept him from confronting the truth. And Charles had made him face that truth in the worst way possible. Shaq pulled over by a park, his car idling as he sat in silence, staring out the window. It was in this moment of solitude that clarity hit him. It wasn't the car, the status, or the celebrity status that had made him feel validated all these years. It was his identity as an athlete. It was the victories, the cheers from fans, the respect earned through hard work and dedication. But those days were long gone. He had tried to replace that sense of worth with material things, but now he understood that all of that was hollow. He had spent too long hiding behind his public persona. The fame had been a shield, one that kept him from confronting the emptiness within. Now, without that shield, he was left exposed, vulnerable to his own insecurities. The punch wasn't just physical, it was a wake-up call. Charles had, in a sense, forced him to face his own demons. It wasn't just the public perception that had collapsed, it was his perception of himself. Shaq had spent his whole career as the man in control, the one who called the shots, the one who dictated his future. But now, it felt like his past had caught up with him, and he was no longer the one in control. The world had moved on, and he had been left behind in the process. And yet, something inside him stirred. He was not ready to give up. He wasn't ready to be forgotten. As he sat there, a plan began to form in his mind. He couldn't undo what had happened at the dealership, but he didn't need to. He didn't need to rely on a car or material possessions to define him. He didn't need to impress anyone. What he needed was to prove to himself that he could rise above this moment of humiliation. What he needed was redemption, but not the kind that the world would see. This wasn't about winning back fame or status. This was about reclaiming his own sense of worth, his inner strength. He knew he couldn't do this alone. It wasn't about being the hero who saves the day with a flashy return. It was about doing the hard work of rebuilding, of looking inward and confronting the things he had ignored for years. Shaq had spent his whole life being a larger-than-life figure, but now he had to become something else, a man who could be vulnerable, a man who could reflect on his own weaknesses and still stand tall. The realization hit him: the only way out of this was through self-awareness and growth. It wasn't the car or the image that mattered, it was how he chose to move forward. He could stay stuck in the past, clinging to the remnants of his former self, or he could embrace the challenge of rebuilding from the inside out. But to do that, he had to confront the man who had humiliated him, the man who had brought him face to face with his own insecurities, Charles. Shaq knew what he had to do. He had to go back to the dealership. Not as the former athlete trying to reclaim his place, not as the man seeking approval, but as someone who had faced his own limitations and was ready to turn the page. This wasn't about winning over Charles or the dealership. This was about Shaq winning back his own respect, by facing the situation head-on, by using his own psychological acumen to understand the man who had struck him down. He wasn't going back for revenge. He was going back to understand why Charles had done what he had done. To break through the wall that Charles had built around himself, the wall of pride and bitterness. Shaq was going to show him that pride wasn't the answer. He wasn't going to throw punches or demand an apology. He was going to break Charles down the only way he knew how, by exposing the insecurities and fears that Charles was hiding behind. It was a different kind of battle. One that couldn't be won with fists or force. This was a battle of minds. And Shaq knew he had the tools to win it. He had always understood people. He had been a leader, a mentor to so many young athletes, and now it was time for him to lead himself out of this crisis. He could see the cracks in Charles's facade now. Charles had his own battles, his own broken pieces, and Shaq was going to show him that vulnerability could lead to strength, not weakness. Shaq wasn't going to be defined by the punch, by the humiliation, or by the public perception anymore. He was going to redefine himself on his own terms. And that journey started with one simple realization: he wasn't going to give up. Not now, not ever. Shaq returned to the dealership, but this time, everything felt different. He didn't come in the same way as before, full of pride, expecting respect simply because of who he was. This time, he came as a man who had seen the cracks in his own armor, a man who had confronted his own insecurities. He had something to prove, but it wasn't to Charles or anyone else. It was to himself. As he walked through the dealership doors, the air felt thick with tension. The employees were scattered around, pretending not to notice him, but Shaq knew they were all watching. The dealership, with its gleaming cars and cold, sterile atmosphere, no longer held any allure. He wasn't here for a car anymore. He was here to finish what he started, not with confrontation, but with understanding. Charles was behind the desk, his eyes meeting Shaq's as soon as he walked in. The manager's face was tight, defensive, as though he had been expecting this moment. But Shaq didn't speak first. He didn't shout or make demands. He simply stood there, calm, waiting. The silence stretched out, and it felt like the weight of everything, Shaq's past, his mistakes, Charles's bitterness, was hanging in the air between them. Finally, Charles broke the silence, his voice cutting through the stillness. "What do you want? You come back here to make more demands or get a second round of humiliation?" Shaq didn't flinch. He looked directly at Charles, his gaze steady. No, Shaq replied, his voice quiet but firm. I came here because I need to understand. Charles scoffed, clearly unimpressed. Understand what? I don't have time for your games. But Shaq was unfazed. He didn't respond with anger. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his tone more reflective than confrontational. I understand that you have a lot of anger. But I think you're angry about more than just me. You've got something you're hiding, something that's been eating at you for a long time. Charles looked away, as if trying to dismiss the conversation before it even started. But Shaq wasn't going to let him. Shaq knew exactly how to read people. He had spent years reading opponents, studying their weaknesses, and now he was applying that knowledge to something far more complex: human emotions, fear, insecurity. I didn't just come here to fight, Shaq continued. I came here because I get it. I know what it's like to hide behind something. To try to hold on to a past that doesn't exist anymore. I've done it for years. But the thing is, that doesn't get you anywhere. It only leaves you empty. And I can see that's where you are right now. Empty. There was a long pause. Charles seemed to stiffen, his jaw tightening. For a moment, Shaq thought he might walk away, that he might just shut the door on this conversation and pretend it never happened. But Charles didn't leave. Instead, he took a deep breath and set his gaze on Shaq, his voice lower now, almost reluctant. You don't know anything about me, Charles muttered. You think you can just waltz in here, all high and mighty, and expect me to open up? You think I haven't been dealing with people like you my whole life? All you celebrities who think your fame can fix everything. You're all the same. Shaq nodded, understanding. I was the same once. But I learned that fame doesn't fill the void. It just hides it, masks it. And when that mask comes off, all that's left is the truth. And the truth is, we're all just trying to get by, to survive our own insecurities. Charles scoffed again, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. And you think you're some kind of expert on insecurity? You don't know the first thing about what I've been through. I don't need to know everything about you to know that we're not so different, Shaq responded calmly. You hate what you see in the mirror because it reminds you of all the things you've never dealt with. And me? I hated myself because I wasn't the person I thought I was anymore. The moment I stopped being a star on the court, I didn't know who I was. And that scared me. The words hung in the air, heavier than either of them expected. Charles's expression faltered for a moment, his defenses slipping just a little. Shaq could see the cracks, the vulnerability underneath the hardened exterior. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show that Charles wasn't as unshakable as he tried to appear. Look, I'm not here to force you to talk about your past, Shaq said, his tone softening. I just want you to understand that we're all human. We all have things we're hiding, things we don't want others to see. But we can't keep running from it. Eventually, it catches up with us. Charles's face hardened again, but Shaq could see the conflict behind his eyes. He was struggling with something deeper than just resentment toward Shaq. The anger, the bitterness, it wasn't about Shaq's fame or the punch. It was about something Charles had never let anyone in on. The manager had spent so many years building walls around himself that the idea of taking them down felt terrifying. I'm not asking you to like me, Shaq continued. I'm not even asking you to apologize for what you did. But I want you to understand that you don't have to live this way. The pride you're holding on to, it's killing you. It's holding you back from the kind of life you could have. The kind of life where you don't have to hide behind anger or pride. A life where you can actually live. Charles's jaw tightened again, but there was something in his eyes now, a flicker of realization, maybe even regret. It wasn't much, but it was there. Shaq stood up straight, his voice calm but firm. I came back here because I'm not looking for validation anymore. I'm not looking for anything from you. But if you ever want to stop hiding, if you ever want to find a way out of this bitterness, I'm here. I don't need to be the person I was. But I need to be someone who can look in the mirror and not hate what I see. He turned to walk away, the silence behind him deafening. For the first time in a long time, Shaq felt a sense of peace. He had come back to the dealership not for a car, not for approval, but to show that there was more to him than what the world had seen. There was growth, redemption, and the willingness to face the truth about himself and about the people around him. As he left, Shaq didn't look back. He had won without saying another word. He had shown Charles, and himself, that it wasn't about the punch or the humiliation. It was about finding a way to move forward, no matter how painful the truth might be. Charles sat in his office, staring at the empty chair across from him. Shaq had left without any fanfare, without a dramatic exit or final words. And yet the words that Shaq had spoken were still hanging in the air, like an echo that refused to fade. It had been a subtle attack, one that didn't come in the form of insults or anger. It had come in the form of honesty, of vulnerability, something Charles wasn't used to. And it had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He hadn't meant to react the way he did. The punch, the words, it all happened so quickly, without thought, without understanding. He had been so consumed with his bitterness toward celebrities and people like Shaq that he didn't stop to see the man behind the fame. He didn't stop to understand that Shaq was just as human as anyone else, struggling with his own insecurities, trying to find meaning beyond the public image that once defined him. Charles had spent years building walls around himself, each brick placed carefully, a defense against the world that had tried to tear him down. He had seen the way people used their fame to get what they wanted, how they manipulated situations, how they used their influence to escape the consequences of their actions. He had watched too many people like that get away with everything, and he had come to despise them. But Shaq wasn't like that. Shaq didn't come in demanding respect, didn't come in trying to prove his worth. He came in quietly, humbly, trying to find his own way through a world that had left him behind. The fact that he didn't respond with anger, that he didn't lash out or fight back, made Charles realize that maybe, just maybe, he had misjudged him. Charles had spent so much of his life holding on to anger, to resentment, to a deep sense of unfairness. It had been his driving force, his reason for getting up every day. He had convinced himself that his bitterness was justified, that it was what kept him strong. But now, after hearing Shaq's words, after seeing the man behind the public persona, he realized that his pride, his anger, had only held him back. He thought about his father, about the way his father had failed him, the way his father had used him as a pawn in a world of greed and manipulation. It had been his father's arrogance that had ruined them, that had driven a wedge between them. And Charles had sworn to never let that happen to him. He had sworn never to be like his father, but somewhere along the way, he had become him. He had let bitterness shape his every action, his every thought. He had become a man whose pride and anger had defined him, and now he realized that those very things were the shackles that had kept him in a cage. As Charles sat there in the quiet of his office, he felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He was tired of carrying around the weight of his past, tired of pretending that everything was fine. He had spent so many years convincing himself that he was right, that his anger was justified, but now, he wasn't so sure anymore. The walls he had built around himself were starting to feel suffocating, and for the first time in a long time, he wondered what life would be like if he tore them down. Shaq had offered him an out, a chance to face the truth without judgment, without fear. He had shown him that there was more to life than holding on to pride and anger. But Charles wasn't sure if he was ready to take that step. It wasn't easy. It wasn't something that could be fixed with a few words or a single conversation. It was going to take work, effort, and vulnerability, things Charles had spent his whole life avoiding. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the cars on the lot. The dealership, with all its glimmering luxury and superficial charm, felt empty to him now. It wasn't about the cars, the money, or the status. It wasn't even about being better than anyone else. It was about something more, something that had eluded him for so long. And as he stood there, watching the people come and go, he realized that the true cost of pride wasn't just the damage it did to others. It was the toll it took on himself. Charles thought about Shaq again, about the way the man had walked away from the confrontation with dignity, not pride. He hadn't been the man who demanded respect, he had earned it. In that quiet, calm manner, Shaq had shown Charles that there was a different way to live. A way that didn't require anger, that didn't require defending yourself at every turn. A way that allowed you to be vulnerable, to be real, without the fear of losing everything. The truth was, Charles had been afraid. Afraid of letting go of the anger that had kept him sharp, kept him on edge. He had been afraid of facing the parts of himself that he had buried for so long. But now, sitting there in his office, he realized that maybe it was time to face those fears. Maybe it was time to break free of the walls he had built. Maybe it was time to stop hiding behind the pride that had kept him locked away. Charles took a deep breath, his gaze still fixed on the dealership below. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of anger pressing down on him. He didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. He didn't need to be right all the time, didn't need to be better than everyone else. What he needed was to be real, to be honest with himself, and with the people around him. The process wouldn't be easy, and Charles knew that. He had spent too many years hiding from the truth, too many years convincing himself that his pride was his strength. But now, he understood that true strength came from letting go of that pride, from being vulnerable and open. As he turned away from the window, he made a decision. It wasn't a grand, dramatic gesture, it wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. But it was a step in the right direction. Charles was ready to change. Ready to face the things he had been running from for so long. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to live a life that wasn't defined by anger or bitterness, but by something more meaningful. Something real. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he couldn't go back to the way things had been. The punch had been the catalyst, but it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. And Charles was finally ready to turn the page. Charles sat alone in his office late into the evening, staring at the papers in front of him. The usual hum of the dealership was long gone, replaced by the quiet sound of his own thoughts. It had been days since Shaq's visit, and the encounter had left an indelible mark on him. He couldn't stop thinking about the words Shaq had said, the vulnerability, the calmness in the face of humiliation. It had all challenged everything Charles had believed about himself, about what it meant to be strong, to be respected. It made him realize how deeply his own pride had shaped his life, how much of his energy had gone into defending it, even when it didn't serve him. Charles was tired of carrying the weight of his own expectations, tired of pretending that his anger and bitterness had kept him strong. He had spent so many years convincing himself that the only way to survive in this world was to hold tight to pride, to control every situation, and to never show weakness. But Shaq had shown him that true strength wasn't about controlling everything around you, it was about controlling what was inside. It was about letting go of the things that didn't matter and being real with yourself and others. The punch he had thrown at Shaq, the anger he had let loose, felt foolish now. It was a moment of blind rage, one that had only served to further entrench the divide between himself and the world. But it wasn't too late to change. Charles knew that now. He couldn't undo what he had done, but he could learn from it. He could stop hiding behind the walls of pride and bitterness that had kept him from seeing the truth. But where did he start? How did he begin the process of unlearning everything that had defined him for so long? Shaq had given him a glimpse of a different way to live, but it wasn't a quick fix. It wasn't something that could be solved in one conversation or in one moment of realization. It would take time, effort, and, most importantly, vulnerability. Charles stood up from his desk and walked to the window, his gaze wandering over the cars on the lot. The shiny, polished vehicles that had once represented success, status, and power now seemed hollow to him. They were symbols of a world that had lost its meaning. In the past, he had seen the cars as tools of control, tools to impress, to show the world that he was in charge. But now, standing there, he understood that they were just objects. They didn't define who he was. They didn't make him a better person. For the first time in years, Charles wasn't thinking about the dealership, the cars, or the money. He was thinking about himself, about his own flaws, his own fears. He had built an empire around the idea that he was better than everyone else, that his pride and his control over the world made him invincible. But he wasn't invincible. He was just like everyone else, imperfect, vulnerable, afraid of being exposed. And the longer he tried to hide from that truth, the more he sank into a life of isolation, resentment, and loneliness. Charles had tried to convince himself that his pride was what made him strong, that it was what kept him sharp, but now he saw that it was just a mask. A mask he had worn for years to hide from his own insecurities, to hide from the parts of himself that he feared. But the fear wasn't going away. It had been there all along, eating away at him, and the only way to deal with it was to face it head on. He had to admit that he was afraid. Afraid of being weak, afraid of losing control, afraid of letting people see who he really was. It wasn't easy to face those fears, but Shaq had shown him that it was the only way to grow. It was the only way to break free from the cycle of bitterness and resentment that had held him captive for so long. Charles turned back to his desk, his hands resting on the cool surface. He thought about Shaq again, about the way the man had walked away from the confrontation without a trace of arrogance, without a trace of anger. Shaq had shown him that it was possible to be strong without being proud. It was possible to stand tall without feeling the need to prove something to the world. Shaq's quiet strength, his willingness to show vulnerability, had been a stark contrast to the image Charles had built for himself. Charles knew he couldn't be like Shaq. He wasn't going to suddenly become a different person, but he could change. He could start by letting go of the need to control everything, by letting go of the pride that had consumed him for so long. It wouldn't happen overnight, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. As Charles stood there, lost in thought, he realized that he didn't need to fight anymore. He didn't need to hold on to the anger, the resentment, the pride. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had spent so many years trying to be someone he wasn't, trying to live up to an image that didn't reflect who he really was. But now, he understood that he didn't have to be that person anymore. It was time to let go. Charles knew the road ahead would be difficult. He couldn't erase the past, and he couldn't undo the mistakes he had made. But he could move forward, and he could start fresh. He could start by being honest with himself, by facing his fears, and by accepting that vulnerability was not a weakness, it was a strength. As he sat down in his chair again, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to fight. He didn't feel the need to defend himself or prove anything to anyone. He just needed to be. And in that moment of quiet realization, Charles knew that he was ready to take the first step toward a new life. A life where pride no longer defined him. A life where he could finally be free. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Charles felt a sense of peace. He was no longer afraid. He was ready to embrace the vulnerability, to embrace the change, and to face the future without the heavy burden of pride holding him back. Charles spent the following weeks quietly reflecting on his life, the decisions he had made, and the way he had lived it. He was no longer consumed by the need to prove himself, and the tension that had once hung over his every move had begun to lift. He had spent too much of his time letting bitterness and pride define him, but now, he realized that he had a chance to redefine himself. He wasn't sure exactly how he was going to do it, but he knew it started with letting go. The dealership was still there, still operating as it had before, but something had changed within him. The cars on the lot, the glossy showroom, the prestige, none of it mattered as much anymore. He had always believed that success meant power and control, that it meant having things that others admired. But now, he could see how hollow that pursuit was. Success, he understood now, wasn't about the outward display of wealth or status. It was about the quiet strength of being content with who you were. It was about finding peace within, not in the things that surrounded you. Charles had begun to make subtle shifts in his day-to-day life. He started to listen more, really listen, when people spoke to him. The employees at the dealership, who had long since learned to stay out of his way, began to notice a change in his demeanor. He wasn't as quick to snap at them, wasn't as dismissive of their ideas. He started showing more empathy, offering support instead of criticism. It wasn't about becoming a different person, but about acknowledging that he could do better. He could be better. And he didn't need to be perfect, he just needed to be real. But change wasn't something that happened overnight, and Charles knew that. He couldn't just erase the years of bitterness and pride. He had been carrying that weight for too long, and it wasn't going to be easy to let go of. Every day, he had to remind himself that vulnerability was not a weakness, that it was okay to be imperfect. He had to remind himself that asking for help wasn't a sign of failure, it was a sign of strength. That was the lesson Shaq had tried to teach him, and it was a lesson that was slowly sinking in. Shaq's words had stayed with him, about vulnerability, about the truth of who they both were behind their public facades. For so long, Charles had believed that success meant having it all, maintaining control, keeping others at arm's length. But now he could see how exhausting that mindset was, how much energy he had poured into maintaining an image of invincibility. It was a false armor, and it had kept him isolated. Now, he saw that true success lay in connections, in relationships, in being able to share your true self with others, flaws and all. Charles wasn't ready to go out and apologize to everyone he had wronged in the past. He wasn't ready to make grand gestures of redemption. What he was ready for, though, was to start over, to live in a way that reflected his true self, not the hardened version he had once thought was necessary to survive. He was ready to let go of the armor and let people see who he really was. It wasn't going to be easy. He had spent too many years in that armor to know that it wouldn't come off easily. But for the first time, he was ready to try. At the dealership, the shift didn't go unnoticed. Some of the employees were wary at first, unsure whether this was just another phase in Charles's behavior. But over time, they began to see the sincerity in his actions. He wasn't just acting for show, he was genuinely trying to create an environment that wasn't driven by control, that wasn't fueled by pride. And for the first time in a long time, the atmosphere at the dealership shifted. People began to feel more at ease. They began to trust that they weren't just working for a boss who demanded everything from them. They were working alongside someone who cared, someone who was willing to listen. Charles's decision to change wasn't just about his own growth. It was about creating an environment where others could grow too. It was about leading not from a place of fear, but from a place of understanding. He knew that he couldn't change everything at once, but he could start with small things. He could start with how he treated people, with how he responded to situations. It was about finding balance, not perfection. The dealership's success wasn't defined by the cars it sold, the prices it demanded, or the power it wielded in the market. It was defined by the people who walked through its doors, the customers, the employees, and even the managers. And Charles was beginning to understand that real success, the kind that had lasting value, was built on trust, respect, and connection. Shaq had shown him that. In their brief but impactful conversation, Shaq had opened his eyes to a reality he had long ignored. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about control. It was about being honest, being vulnerable, and allowing people to see you for who you really were. Shaq didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had earned respect, not because of his fame, but because of the way he carried himself, the way he treated others. Shaq had led with humility, and in doing so, he had won over everyone who crossed his path. Charles knew that was the kind of leadership he wanted to embody. Charles wasn't perfect, and he didn't expect to be. He still struggled with old habits, with moments of doubt and insecurity. But he wasn't afraid to face them anymore. He wasn't afraid to acknowledge that he was human, that he didn't have all the answers, and that it was okay to ask for help. It wasn't weakness, it was the strength to admit that he didn't have to do it all on his own. For the first time in years, Charles felt free. Free from the grip of pride that had controlled his life for so long. Free from the need to maintain a perfect image. Free from the weight of expectations, both his own and others. He wasn't afraid to be himself anymore. He wasn't afraid to let go of the past and embrace the future, whatever it held. As the days passed, Charles continued to change, one small step at a time. He didn't know exactly where this journey would lead, but he knew it was the right path. It wasn't about the cars. It wasn't about the status. It was about becoming the kind of person who could look at himself in the mirror and say, "I'm enough. Just as I am." That was the real success, and that was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. Charles had learned a lot in the past few months, but the road to change wasn't as simple as he had hoped. Though he had broken through many layers of pride and fear, there were still moments when the weight of his past would try to pull him back. His old habits, snap judgments, controlling impulses, and the tendency to retreat into anger would surface unexpectedly. He wasn't free from his demons, but he was no longer afraid to face them. The real test, he knew, was not in the reflection he saw in the mirror but in how he interacted with the world. He had to prove to himself that he could remain grounded, that his transformation wasn't just a temporary phase but a permanent shift. Each decision, each encounter, was another step in proving that he could live a life based on authenticity and humility. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being honest with himself and others. Charles had begun to open up more to his employees. He had stopped leading with fear and began engaging with his team in a more collaborative way. It wasn't always easy, and not everyone was quick to accept the changes. Some still saw him as the hard-nosed, judgmental manager they had always known. But Charles didn't mind. He understood that trust wasn't something that could be earned overnight, it had to be built over time, through consistent actions and respect. One of the biggest changes he noticed in himself was his ability to listen. In the past, he had always been quick to shut people down, to dismiss their ideas or concerns if they didn't align with his vision. But now, he took the time to hear them out. He asked questions instead of issuing commands. He sought feedback, both positive and negative. And when he didn't have the answer, he wasn't afraid to admit it. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't just playing a role. He was being himself, unapologetically, imperfectly, and with all his flaws exposed. The customers noticed, too. The atmosphere at the dealership had shifted. It was no longer just a place to buy a car, it had become a place where people felt heard and valued. Charles's presence was no longer intimidating, it was calming. His vulnerability had created a space where others could also feel safe enough to be themselves. The sales team, once wary of his moods, now approached him with a newfound respect. They could see that he wasn't just a boss anymore, he was a leader, one who led by example, not by fear. Still, there were moments when the temptation to fall back into his old ways crept in. He found himself getting impatient when things didn't go as planned, when employees made mistakes or when customers were difficult. But each time, he caught himself. He took a breath. He reminded himself that this wasn't about control, it was about connection. It was about navigating challenges with patience and understanding, not with anger and frustration. One afternoon, as he sat in his office reflecting on the progress he had made, a thought crossed his mind. Could this change go beyond just the dealership? Could it ripple out into the world? Charles knew that the real power of his transformation lay in how it influenced those around him, how it encouraged others to embrace their own vulnerability and authenticity. That was the kind of change he wanted to see in the world. Not a superficial change, not a change driven by pride or status, but a change rooted in empathy, respect, and understanding. He knew he wasn't the same man who had thrown Shaq out of the dealership months ago. That man had been defensive, driven by fear, and too proud to admit his shortcomings. The man standing here now was one who understood that growth was a continuous process, that there would always be setbacks, but that every step forward mattered. He had learned that forgiveness, both for himself and others, was essential to living a life of peace. He had learned that success wasn't measured by the cars on the lot, but by the relationships he built and the legacy he left behind. Charles didn't want to be remembered as a man who built a successful dealership. He wanted to be remembered as a man who had the courage to change, to evolve, and to inspire others to do the same. It was no longer about proving himself to the world. It was about proving to himself that he could be a better person, that he could live a life aligned with his values. One of the most meaningful aspects of his journey was the way he had learned to forgive. He had spent so many years angry at his father, at the world, at the people who had wronged him. But as time passed, he realized that holding on to that anger had only hurt him. It had kept him chained to a version of himself that he no longer wanted to be. The first step toward healing had been forgiving himself, and that had opened the door for him to forgive others. He didn't need to hold on to resentment anymore. He didn't need to carry the weight of past mistakes or failures. Shaq had been a catalyst in this process. His visit to the dealership had been the moment that forced Charles to face the truth. Shaq hadn't come to him for revenge or to fight back. He had come to show him that there was a different way to approach life. A way rooted in humility and self-awareness. And though their confrontation had been intense, it had been a turning point for Charles. It had shown him that strength didn't come from controlling others, but from mastering himself. Charles thought about his legacy. The legacy he had always assumed would be defined by his success in business, by the wealth he accumulated, and the empire he built. But now, he understood that a true legacy wasn't defined by external accomplishments. It was defined by the impact you had on the people around you, by how you treated others, and by how you lived your life. His legacy, he realized, was about showing others that it was possible to change, to break free from the chains of pride and fear, and to live a life that was meaningful and authentic. The dealership was thriving in its own way, but the real transformation was happening inside of him. Charles was no longer seeking validation from others. He didn't need the approval of his customers or his employees. What mattered now was how he felt about himself, how he carried himself in the world. He had come to understand that success wasn't about accumulating wealth or status. It was about living a life of integrity and authenticity. As he stood in front of his office window, watching the sunset over the lot, Charles smiled. He knew he wasn't perfect. He knew he still had a long way to go. But for the first time in his life, he felt at peace with who he was. He had taken the first steps toward becoming the man he had always hoped to be. And that, in itself, was enough.